My name is Kody Chamberlain, and I'm going to kind of just quickly talk about my background so you kind of see where I'm coming from, and then also get into some of my ideas and philosophies on creative arts, illustration, design, things like that. You can also follow me on Twitter, Kody Chamberlain, for the tweet bots out there. The stuff I'm going to talk about today is a modification of the presentation I did at the HOW Design Conference in Boston this last year. I was invited to be one of the featured guests and had a blast. It was actually my first time at HOW was to do a presentation. And if any of you haven't gone yet, I recommend it. It was fantastic. But my presentation is called Cranking the Creative Trebuchet, Creative Lessons from Bruce Lee, Jaws, and Dumbo the Flying Elephant. And that's a trebuchet for those of you not familiar. It's sort of like a catapult. It's just a way of creating leverage to get more power out of the boulders you're throwing. And of course, this was the poster we did for the HOW Design Conference, sponsored by Nina Paper. They really came through, and the posters came out amazing. So a quick intro and portfolio. A few recent credits include Warner Brothers, MTV, Image Comics, Universal Pictures, etc. Quite a lot of different fields, but mostly doing the same type of work within these fields. My background is actually in design and advertising. I got a BFA in advertising design from UL Lafayette, and worked my way through several different agencies, started my own studio in 1999 before making the jump to illustration and comics. So my background is in graphic design, lots of branding, logos, and I still do a bit of design work for friends, family, and people I just like. So I'm able to be a little more picky nowadays, which is nice. That sort of segued into illustration. So I work in many different styles. You can see a sort of a semi-realistic style, something very cartoony, almost street art-like, and a lot of things in between. And through comics and illustration and design, I've made a lot of different contacts. Networking is one of the things I like to do when I travel to conventions and trade shows and stuff like that. And just meeting people through the years, whether they're fans of my work or I'm fans of theirs, we make connections and projects and collaborations come through. And one of those is MTV. I've done quite a bit of work for MTV through the years. And there's a project they launched. It's actually a puppet similar to Triumph the Insult Dog you might have seen on Conan O'Brien. It's actually some of the same creators. They created a project called Warren the Ape, and that's the piece on the left here. So I did a promotional comic for their character to introduce a live action show. And the comic actually went out to 35 million people inside the MTV newsletter, which is pretty cool. And the project on the right is from a show you may have heard of called Jersey Shore. And I hadn't actually seen the show. They sent me some YouTube clips and said that one of the promotional things they wanted to do on the show was to have each character on the show done as a comic book character, and they kind of let us pick. And I tuned into this guy right away. He was sort of a bodybuilder, steroid type. He was very angry. One of the clips I saw, he was throwing a television through the window. So I decided he would make a great Orange Hulk. And the guy's name is Ronnie on Jersey Shore. And I'm told that he really liked the poster and that it's actually hanging behind his desk. And if you're like me, you're wondering why Ronnie from Jersey Shore would need a desk. I don't know. Some weird transitions into the music industry in a sort of backhanded way, I guess. Trace Adkins created a character with a writer named David Tishman called Luke McBain. And the initial concept was that it was going to be an all-new character, an original character, not based on Trace Adkins himself, just a character he created. And the publisher and the writer, they could tell right away that it was smart to try and use his likeness because the guy has a massive fan base. So we did a little bit of coercion. I did this test sheet to sort of show him what he looks like as a person illustrated into a comic. He ended up really liking it, and he lent his likeness to the book. And now we're actually in Walmart, which is huge for a graphic novel. I mean, any product in a Walmart is fantastic. So the project's called Luke McBain, and it actually just hit shelves a couple weeks ago in Walmarts and, of course, all the bookstores and Amazon and stuff as well. Also into video games lately, again, purely by accident, just through comic projects, but there's a character called Blood Rain. She's sort of a vampire hunter type. So I've done some comic work for that. And also I'm working on one right now that I can't really talk about, but comes out in December. So it's a brand new game that we're started doing a promotional comic for that's going to tie in directly with the storyline. And one of the more weird projects, there's a crime writer I love named Duane Trzynski. Anyone read Duane Trzynski? Highly recommend it if you like crime books. He's got a character named Charlie Hardy who is basically the concept of this character is he's just really hard to kill. And that's the sort of setup for the storylines. But Dwayne also writes comic books. And he writes for Marvel and DC, mostly superhero work. And he was trying to figure out a way to promote his comics to his book fans and to promote his books to his comic fans. So we actually did a comic based on the character from the book. And this went out through the HarperCollins newsletter, and they gave it away at a bunch of conventions as a freebie. All the digital comic sites and the services like Comixology gave it away for free. And MTV ran it on the front page. So it was a nice promo for him to showcase his character and create some crossover. I've actually been doing quite a bit of movie work and tie-in with movie work lately. This is a project I did for Lucas, and it was Indiana Jones Heritage Series. So when they do this is actually trading cards, the little small trading cards that everyone's kind of familiar with, sort of the same size as a baseball card. And there's a big market, collectors love these things. And the series itself were behind-the-scenes photos on the set of the various Indiana Jones movies, scenes from the movie, things like that. They also have photo cards of like Harrison Ford and George Lucas, and they'll actually sign them. And those are the rare cards, and they're called chase cards in the industry. And one of the things they do with the chase cards is they actually hire a few artists to hand draw cards, and those hand-drawn cards get put into the decks. And so they're extremely rare. The card set itself may have had a few million, and I drew 106 cards total. So those are pretty rare. Most of them end up on eBay, honestly, but it's a fun little thing to do, and people love getting them. And to get approved by Lucasfilms is actually kind of a tricky process. You have to run the gauntlet and kind of eat your way up the food chain to finally get in there. This is a project called Watchmen. This is actually the movie directed by Zack Snyder based on the original graphic novel by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. When it came time to do the adaptation, there's so much material in the graphic novel they had to start cutting stuff out. And rather than delete it completely, Zack Snyder had the idea to break off certain parts of it and do tie-in projects. So one of those projects was Tales of the Black Freighter, and that became an animation, and I was able to do conceptual art for the animation. And for those of you not familiar with conceptual art in the film and animation industry, conceptual art is the first visual created from the screenplay. So the screenplay is just text, it's paragraphs, it's dialogue. The conceptual art is sort of trying to bring that to life and create that world. Some of it existed in the comic book, but there's a lot of new story that was created for the animation to sort of expand it and create a full story from it. And so that was quite a bit of fun to create those worlds and then see it later in the actual animation recreated by the animators. And when we first got the Blu-ray, we were kind of freeze framing, trying to spot all the shots I had done. There were quite a few they used. This is a film called Whiskey Bay that actually just shot here in Baton Rouge. Matt Dillon, Willem Dafoe. And it was directed by Chris Brinker, who's probably most known for being the producer of the original Boondock Saints movie. This is his directorial debut. So I did storyboarding on that, working with the director closely, and I had a lot of fun. Really, really good script. I hope the film comes out even half as good as the script. Probably easily the best script I've ever storyboarded. It was fantastic. But it's actually based on a true story that happened in and around the Baton Rouge area in Angola about the Aryan Brotherhood and one of their assassins that sort of crosses over and works with the police. Really fun story, and I mean, it's dark, but it's really well done. Here's some more of that. So you can see storyboards, very loose, very sketchy. It's really just about giving the director a sense of where the camera should be, where the actor should be, and just trying to assist in the creative vision for the project. Not nearly as detailed as conceptual art. But of course, my home, comics and graphic novels. This is my first fully creator-owned book in that I've done a lot of freelance work where Marvel, DC, they own the characters, that type of thing. This is the first book I owned completely, and I did every job, including story art, coloring, lettering, promotion. Sort of a one-man band on this one. Here's some of the interior work from that. And clearly it's set in New Orleans, so there's a New Orleans streetcar. This is another book I did called Punks, the comic. And for all the old school designers in here, this book was done entirely in paste up. Photocopier, X-Acto blade, and a glue stick. No Photoshop, no drawing anywhere in this comic, except for the finished coloring was done digitally. An entire comic created by hand. But we published this ourselves through a friend of ours, and we did 2 comics total. MTV found it, fell in love with it. That's how my relationship began with MTV and me doing various work for them was through this project. This book is now an MTV comic, and if you jump on Google and search MTV Comics and Punks, it does come up. You can read it for free on the MTV website. It's pretty awesome. free comics are always really cool. So just a quick rundown of the mechanics of sequential art. I am sort of an advocate for sequential art, and I try to push it on everyone I talk to, but this is really basically how it works, right? 2 static panels, and the action in between is really your imagination. It's the same way prose novels works in that you fill in the blanks, and the blanks are visually represented by gutters in comics. Here's a more elaborate version of that same idea. This is by an artist named Chris Ware. I'm a huge fan of his. He's one of the few geniuses in comics, I think. So if you look really close, there's a guy on top of the building, and same concept, right? So I consider comics, graphic novels, and sequential art to be a very highly form of effective communication, and it's also one of the earliest. So if you look at the Lascaux caves, you can actually see the hunting process displayed in sequential images. They were basically showcasing how they would hunt these animals on the walls of the cave. Of course, that actually evolved into what we know today as language, right? The sequential art. But also, think about something like the Heimlich maneuver can be communicated very quickly in 4 images. To try to express this maneuver to someone in an emergency situation using only text would be very cumbersome, it would be very long, very inefficient. So it is an extremely efficient form of communication. And it's also universal, it's independent of language, unless of course you're adding dialogue. So let's talk about inventing a little bit. I think everyone in here does some inventing on some level. Thomas Edison said to invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk, right? So you need something to start with. And what happens if you don't have a pile of junk? So this is sort of my process. I'm going to quickly walk through my creative process. I call it making clay. So you need something to start with to mold it into something better. And of course, there's a writer's term everyone uses. Don't get it right, just get it started, or just get it written. It's very common. And it's just about starting and being okay with letting it be bad at first. And then you can always make it better later. So for the process junkies here, I track my thoughts. I email myself ideas constantly because I won't lose them that way. If I write it in a sketchbook, it may get closed. I may discover it later. So anytime I do create an idea, it ends up in my sketchbook and my notebooks. I also email that same idea to myself. So I'm always tracking it. Of course, sketchbooks. Lots of doodles go in the sketchbooks. This is the type of idea that might end up in there. I came up with one recently. Sucker MCs, lollipop shaped like tiny microphones. I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but it's just an idea I'm tracking. Here's one. I call it a hypotenuse. Again, it has no purpose, just some idea in my sketchbooks. So what happens in the comic creation process, a little bit different, good ideas begin to clump, right? So a good character moment merges with a good character, and a good ending merges with that scene that has that character. And that's sort of how story ideas are born for me. And I know it happens differently for other creators, but what ends up happening for me is each idea ends up on an index card, and I pin it to my giant. I have one entire wall in my studio is cork, and it's amazing if you don't have one, but I just pour my brain out onto this cork wall. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are issue numbers for comics. This is the book that I showed earlier called Sweets as I was working on that. So each scene, each character, each story beat ends up on an index card, and it goes up on the wall. So that allows me to see everything at once. I'm a visual person. It's really tough for me to outline something just in a word processor. So I need to see it. I need to move stuff around, add, remove cards. And basically, I'm making clay, right? I'm building something from nothing. That also includes sketches, character moments, just little ideas. You can see I'm even working on the logo down here on this bottom page. Some character sketches for an upcoming project. The logo, doodling logos out. There's a cab inside the comic called the Kingfish Cab Company, so I'm doing sketches using a piranha. All sorts of stuff in there. And of course, that slowly merges into fully blown out scene ideas and different angles. I'm experimenting. There's a graveyard scene. What's the best way to indicate that? The most dramatic way to showcase that. And here's a little bit more detail of what my thumbnailing process looks like. And as you can see, my thumbnailing process for my comics is nearly identical to my storyboarding process in filmmaking, and nearly identical to my sketch process in logo design. The fundamentals are exactly the same across the board. So execute your ideas. So the good ideas get made, the bad ideas get dead. And I think this is where most people fail. The judgment is lacking, and they can't always identify what's good and what's bad, and they progress with a bad idea. So there's another writing term that's called kill your darlings. I'm sure some of you heard that before. Kill your darlings. And it's all about if you love something, but it's just not appropriate, it's just not working, you have to get rid of it, before you waste time on it. To try to do it later in the process is tough. So once you have your clay and you have your idea and you have your note cards or whatever it is you're working on, that's when I begin to sculpt. And for me, I write full script format for my comics. And if any of you have ever seen a screenplay, it's identical to a screenplay. I've also done some writing when I was in advertising for television, things like that, using the same format. It's basically scene description, what the camera sees, and then dialogue, what the microphone hears, right? And that's pretty much what script writing is. And so I write my comics full script, and I write everything up front before anything gets drawn. And then, of course, I go to the drawing stage where I use traditional materials. I do pencil, using an old school pencil and ink with brush and quill. And one of the reasons for that is there's a little bit of a misconception that digital is faster. And in the illustration world, it's really not, because every line laid down with a pencil is a line laid down with a stylus, right? So it's really about how quickly you can generate ideas and move your hand across your canvas. So I can draw digitally. I've drawn pages completely digitally, and I still continue to if I have to. But drawing traditionally has another advantage for me in that there's a collector's market for original artwork. And so I can actually sell the hand-drawn pages for each comic and generate an additional revenue stream that I wouldn't have if I did fully digital. So that's one of the other reasons. So here you can see some close-up of some of the pencil work. Again, my cork wall, as I progress on an issue, fills up with finished art versus note cards. And here's a drawing table here. It's a little dark, but you can sort of make it out. And of course, everything is drawn black and white, colored digitally. I use Photoshop. Most of you are familiar with that, and Illustrator for the finished lettering. And of course, how do you know when you're done? That's one of the toughest things to do in illustration, because you can work and nurture an illustration forever and never really know exactly when it's done. So I came up with this little anecdote I use when I teach classes. When you catch a butterfly, stop swinging the net. Right? So when the project works, when visually it's working, that's when you stop. Even if it feels a little bit raw. What I found through the years is something raw tends to be more interesting to the audience than something that's very, very polished and maybe photorealistic. It starts to get a little bit boring, right? So and especially in illustration, if you approach the point of perfection and photorealism, you're better off using a photo, because otherwise you're kind of wasting your time on all that time you put in. And also in comics, our audience, unlike film, they tend to embrace the mistakes and the imperfections and the little lines and ticks. If you're watching a movie, a sci-fi movie about spaceships, and you can see the wires hanging the ships, that's considered a flaw in filmmaking. In the comic industry, the hand of the artist, the fans really like it. They love seeing it. And so they embrace style, they embrace all the little tricks and stuff we do. So I try not to stray from that. So if and when I think the panel is working and it's drawn, I'll even not ink background details sometimes. If I hit that point where this panel works, I move to the next one. That goes for story too. So I sort of tricked you all with the Dumbo, Flying Elephant, Bruce Lee stuff. The real reason I wanted to talk to you is the power of the pencil. And here's a pencil sketch. But you know, the point to make is that sketching is not a gift, it's a process. And so here you can see a bunch of sketchbooks. And top creators rarely show their sketch work because it's usually terrible, it's usually hideous. And the end result is the assumption that they create without it. And that's usually not true. So here's what I like people to think my sketchbooks look like. This is my wife, Christy, here. We went on a nice cruise, and we stopped at Roatan, and I sat on the balcony of the ship, and I did this great illustration. And this is what I like people to think my sketchbook looks like. But this is what it actually looks like. 99% of all my sketchbook pages are complete rubbish. You can't tell what's going on. It's me sort of thinking my way through good ideas and bad ideas, and I'm just trying to find something that works. And it's only later that the finished work comes out and ends up looking like something. So the point is, sketching is not about good drawing, it's about good thinking. It's about finding that good idea. And to sort of prove my point, I brought some cool examples. Bad drawings by brilliant creators. So here's Alfred Hitchcock, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese. These are probably my three favorite directors. Coppola's in there too, but I couldn't find any bad drawings by Coppola. Here's some very bad drawings, hand done by Alfred Hitchcock. Absolutely horrible drawings by Spielberg. I can't even make out what that bottom thing is. But you can see the top sort of looks like a car. And of course, Martin Scorsese's really bad drawings. Hideous stuff. But I think everyone would agree that these are all three brilliant minds with very bad drawings. And here you can see a close-up comparison of Scorsese's Taxi Driver to the finished piece. And I think it's pretty obvious the idea is there, right? Everyone would agree the idea is complete before he shoots his movie. Some more bad drawings by brilliant creators. Early Walt Disney drawings of Mickey Mouse, Pac-Man. Patent drawings. If anyone in here has never looked at patent drawings, they are hysterical. And of course, I'm not immune to this either. This is a very bad drawing I did on my iPhone on an airplane. And you can see that actually became the cover to my graphic novel here. So the idea was there, right, even though the drawing's hideous. Thomas Edison, who we all know and love. Here's some bad sketches by him. So in fact, so funny that he actually made a note here, make good drawing. So he was completely aware that he was drawing badly. But again, it's about the concept. So drawing is really all about concepts, especially the sketching process. So his note there, make good drawing. Once you have a good idea, you can always get help. But if you're the idea person, my opinion is you should be generating those ideas. You should be sketching those ideas and completing them to the fullest extent that you can. But of course, even brilliant minds get help. I'm sure everyone in here knows who Saul Bass is, and if you don't, I highly recommend looking at some of his stuff. But genius logo designer, you know, we've all seen his stuff. Even in, it's almost like every time they try and revise one of these logos, it just gets worse, right? Like the AT&T. I hope no one here works at AT&T, but the redesign of the AT&T logo, I think, is many, many steps down from the original. And of course, probably the single most famous scene in movie history, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the shower scene, right? Storyboarded by Saul Bass. A lot of people don't know that. And I just showed you earlier how Alfred Hitchcock would actually storyboard his own movies. But this scene was incredibly complex, had some intricacies to it that he felt he needed help on. So he brought in Saul Bass, who actually did quite a bit of storyboarding. A lot of the James Bond intros and things like that were also done by Saul Bass. The more you know. So the point of all this is we can't all draw like Peter Paul Rubens, right? But you can probably outdraw Hitchcock, and that's a pretty big achievement. So I say sketching is the tip of the idea iceberg. So some pop culture here, creative lessons from Bruce Lee, Jaws, Dumbo the Flying Elephant. But first, Bob Ross. I love Bob Ross. Anyone here not know who Bob Ross is? Please do your homework. Do your homework tonight. Bob Ross is awesome. He's very famous for doing landscape paintings live on national television, right? That was it. And most of the shows, from what I hear, were actually live. They weren't taped. Oh yeah, he was in the Google. Yeah, that's right. I don't know if it was his birthday or his death day or something, but I remember seeing it. But Bob Ross had a term called the happy accident. And it's an essential lesson on creativity from Bob Ross. So Bob Ross would be on live national television working on a painting, right? And it's almost done. Beautiful landscape with a river and trees. And he would turn to face the camera and his palette would scrape across the canvas. And he had this gash in the middle of his painting, right? And that's a mistake. That's an accident. So Bob Ross would smile and he would say, "Ah, happy accident." And he would take out his brush again and he would turn that little scratch into a rock or a tree or some new creative image that he wouldn't have thought of otherwise. He would have never thought to put a rock there. But because he made that mistake, it forced him into a new creative area that he wouldn't have gone. So all of a sudden, there's this new design element in this painting that he would have never thought of. And that was his happy accident. And he embraced those and he loved those. So mistakes, your new best friend, right? And one of the reasons why I continue to work analog and not just digital, I do both fairly seamlessly, but computers don't make mistakes. The thing we love about computers in the finished process is they're pretty much flawless. A straight line on a computer is perfectly straight. But in the creative process, that does tend to work against you a little bit. And so analog and digital are not rivals. They get along quite well, actually. So Punks is done entirely analog until I color it, then it's digital. So I take advantage of each one, every area that lends itself to that process. And one of the great things about the Punks comic is it's meant to be raw and edgy and rough. And so I can create a Punks page. I can do about 7 of these comic pages a day, analog. If I tried to do it digitally, it would probably take me a full day per page, maybe 2 days for a page, digital, to create this same look. So there's an efficiency built in that creates its own stylistic elements. I was asked to do a new trade dress for the Trace Adkins graphic novel called Luke McBain. And he said he wanted something kind of rough and distressed. And he cited specifically the Punks look. Something like the Punks look is what he said. So I did the basic design in Illustrator, nice and clean. Took about 10, 15 minutes. I printed it out. I took it outside on the concrete, folded it 4 times, and I hit it with my shoe. Unfolded it, scanned it in, and then vectorized it, and I had the finished design. And I've worked at agencies quite a bit, and I've seen people spend 3-4 days trying to create this look in Photoshop, poking at it with brushes, and it's a terrible idea. If you're trying to make an image look like acrylic paint, use acrylic paint, right? Don't try to recreate acrylic paint in Photoshop. It's very counterintuitive, and it's very slow. It's a very slow process. So technology is a tool, but it's not the only tool. But of course, there's always an exception, right? Pixar does absolutely brilliant work, and this is their tool. It's called the Pixar Render Farm. It's this massive, proprietary server system that they use in their building. So they get pretty great results with nothing but computer technology. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure how these sketches got in there. My apologies. Okay, Walt Disney here doing what's called a storyboard walkthrough, and he would actually go beat by beat, and they would create each scene from the movie on a little card and pin it to the wall. And then they'd go on to the next one, on to the next one. And it was called a walkthrough. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. But thankfully, Pixar came along and revolutionized that idea. Now what Pixar does is they hand draw each scene onto a card and they pin it to the wall and they do a walkthrough. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. So obviously I'm kidding, but you can see Pixar pretty much does the exact same process Walt Disney did, all the way down to they've actually doubled or tripled the quantity of storyboards Disney used to do for the average movie. Pixar gets incredibly detailed on their storyboarding. And again, all drawn by hand on paper, pinned to a wall. And we're talking about the company that has the most powerful computing technology in the world. And they still develop their entire movie on paper before they go digital. And that's one of the reasons why I stick with digital, same reason they do. It just benefits the creative process to a very high degree. So some of the benefits of analog. Happy accidents, as Bob Ross just taught us. The important things also take over. When you're forced to sketch something or draw something, your mind automatically leaves out the things that don't matter. Also, fast evolution of ideas. You'll see an idea change and grow very quickly, where if you're an illustrator or you're in Photoshop working on something, you're dealing with the tools and the limitations of that world, and you're sort of slowly adapting your design, hoping to get something good. Whereas if you take a pencil on a sheet of paper, it progresses very quickly. It gives tangible form to abstract concepts, and problems instantly become apparent. And I say being creative saves time. So we think sketching is going to take time away from my finished logo design, therefore my logo won't be as good. But it's actually the opposite. Sketching actually speeds things up. So here's a useful technique I use quite a bit, actually. A common problem, the typeface you want to use is missing, right? That happens a lot. There are a million things just like this that happen in the average workday in art studio, design studio. The usual solution, find the typeface, right? So now you're digging on CDs, you're digging through old clients' files, you're looking for that font. The creative solution is use a typeface you already have installed. It seems like a creative limitation, but it's actually a challenge. It's a creative challenge now. Can you raise the bar? Can you do something great with a font you have on hand versus digging for that favorite font? And I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems to me like the most creative people I know also tend to be the most productive. Some of you are probably familiar with Von Glitschka. It seems like there's 5 of this guy just cranking out great design work all the time. And he's one of those guys that sort of follows these processes. So I love sketchbooks. I recommend everyone use sketchbooks. And if you do, I have a few techniques that I like to use. This oscillating sketchbooks happened mostly because I'm disorganized. I'll throw a sketchbook in my bag. There's 1 on the side of the bed. There's 3 somewhere in my studio. So anytime I go to a meeting or a client meeting, or I'm just generating ideas or going somewhere to sketch, I grab a different sketchbook. And what ends up happening is I have 20 or 30 of these sketchbooks in rotation at all times. And I discover old ideas in old sketchbooks that I sort of forgot about, or a lesson I learned, or some little concept that I can now use on a new project. So rather than filling a sketchbook and archiving it, putting it on the shelf to never be looked at again, the sketchbooks stay in rotation, the ideas stay fresh, and all those little creative things you're picking up and working on stay on the top of your head as you create. So that's called oscillating sketchbooks. Gesso, you can buy a can of gesso for very cheap. I add a little bit of gray to give mine a tone, but gesso is basically a base that painters use to cover their canvas before they paint. You can also use it on paper to cover bad drawings or notes you won't need anymore, to sort of give new life to old sketchbooks. It makes a great base. The kind of striping is from the gesso there. So pop culture philosophy, creative lessons. First of all, Bruce Lee, if everyone knows about his movies, but his writing is very interesting because Bruce Lee discussed a lot about style. And in most of his writings, he was against style in a very creative way. So he was of the opinion, use only what works and take it from any place you find it. So if a technique worked, he used it, whether or not it was traditional to that martial arts form, right? So the forms, the katas, all that stuff, none of it mattered unless it worked. If it worked, he kept it and he used it in his martial arts. Dumbo, the flying elephant, the guy with the big ears, right? It's a very old Disney cartoon, but Dumbo basically had the ability to fly, and he believed it was a magic feather. But the magic feather was just a gag. He could actually fly all along, right? When he loses his feather, he could still fly. So the creative inspiration from that is inspiration is a placebo. You don't need it to create. I talk to so many artists or writers that they only create when they're inspired, and if they're not inspired, they get what they think is called writer's block, and they just can't create, right? When you get to the professional level and what you do, as most of you know in your industry, inspiration is not always there. And it's great when we have it, and it's amazing. And you can work twice as fast and be really inspired, but can you still create without it? And I say you can. So I'm sort of anti-writer's block. I think anytime I've ever gotten anything like that, if I work for about a half hour, 45 minutes, and just keep going, it just goes away. It doesn't even exist. So basically my solution is I give myself permission to write or draw badly, and I just keep going. And after a while, I'll get in the groove, it'll get better, and everything's great. Or Chuck Close put a little more bluntly, he said, inspiration is for amateurs. And that's probably true. If you're inspired and you create a great painting, that's awesome. If painting is your job, you have to paint every day, whether you're inspired or not. So it's a good lesson, and I think it's one of those harsh realities that once I finally did figure it out, it's helped me quite a bit. So unsolicited creative advice. Random input, I think, is awesome. My initial concept on creating comics was I needed to lock everyone off, lock the door, focus on this, and eliminate all the distractions. But I found the opposite was better. The more random input I had, the better. Bookstores, toy stores, taking a walk, a shower, any of those things would sort of fuel me creatively. So when I do sit down and start drawing, I have things in my head now that help me do my work. Here's a little term I came up with called collateral thinking. What does one impact have on another? So sending shockwaves or ripples through your project. A lot of times we'll add something new to an existing project that we're working on and leave that thing there. But collateral thinking is what impact does that new thing have on everything else? So if you're introduced, let's say you're working on a website or a brochure, and you introduce a new color. How does that color affect every other color? How does it affect every page? How does it affect the illustrations on that page? Does it affect it? It probably does in some way. On the storytelling level, when Michael gets punched in The Godfather, any other movie, a punch is a punch, and we sort of forget about it instantly. In The Godfather, that punch echoes through the entire movie. That's the moment when Michael switches from being out of the family and he joins the family. It starts a war between all the families, right? That one little punch creates a cascade effect through the entire film and the book. So, to introduce anything into a story should have an impact on the rest of the story, or maybe it shouldn't be there. Same thing goes for design and illustration, logo, collateral thinking. Now, data mining, I did quite a bit of web development as well, too, when I was in advertising. And data mining is a process to try and discover data sets, right? So you're looking for patterns. I built a site years ago called Epoch. It was a hockey store. And he had many different skates that he dealt with, but one of them was Bauer, one of the more popular skate companies. And I remember at one point, Bauer gave him a phone call, and he says, we have an excess of the size 8 skate that just showed up. Can you use all these size 8s? So basically, an entire line of skate just in one size. So the owner of the company, John Williams, he went in, searched his database, and he data mined and found that he did have enough customers that had previously bought size 8 items that maybe he could try and buy these skates and sell them. So he did. He placed the order. He got a super discount on this limited size skate and was able to sell them all through the website because he was data mining to see that he had that user base in his data. But we can also use it in the creative world, too. Just by digging deep, analyzing your core concepts, revisit your backstory if you're a writer. If you're working for a client, revisit their old work. Dissect things, ask why, what if, really dig for that hidden gold. And rather than, again, constantly adding new material to make something fresh, dig through the old material and find that hidden gold. And as a bonus, it also brings depth and subtext to the work. In my world, if I'm writing a story about a detective that's divorced, why is he divorced? How did he meet that person that he married originally? And started to troll through those story points. And of course, across the finish line. As I worked my way through advertising and I worked for various studios, it seemed like every creative person I was with had some side project that was unfinished. A novel, a children's book. A friend of mine has been working on the same children's book for about 10 years now, still unfinished. But a scene is not a movie, an outline is not a novel. Your good idea is just the gun that starts the race. So you have to cross that finish line, or else you'll never get to the next project, you'll never progress. And the trick here is, it's okay to cross the finish line and let the project be bad. It is okay. You can always improve it later. You can always do the next project and apply what you learned, and that project will be better. Keep it real. Spend time with humans. This is something that's becoming more and more prevalent, where we're sort of becoming isolated or just within our core group. And me being a freelancer, most of my design work through the years was as a freelancer, so I didn't have a studio of people I can communicate with. It was basically me alone in a room creating, and it's very difficult. So through the years, I've created my own think tank. And this is the Drink and Draw Social Club, and oddly enough, I don't even drink. But I started it based on another similar concept in Los Angeles that I attended. And it's a group of professional artists and designers that meet up. We meet every week without exception, unless it's a holiday. Like, we skip Halloween, but we meet every single week. There are 4 comic artists in it, about 12 designers, and just a bunch of people that are interested in sketching or drawing. We have 5 or 6 that came for the first time without ever knowing how to draw. And they were basically learning from us. So it's a really great brainstorming group where we sit and we sketch, and there's food, and we pick a nice restaurant. So we actually go to a bar and grill. But we have rules, and if you start one of these, you should have rules too. The first rule is if you show up, you must draw. And that just discourages people from wanting to come and hang out. So anyone that's there, if they're sitting at our table, they must draw. And the second rule is no actual work allowed. So this is the one time a week where we get to come and experiment, try something new we've never done before, and really get out of our own comfort zone. I'm real big about trying to get away from what you know, like step outside your world a little bit. And we do make an exception. You can see the fine print, unless you're under an immovable deadline. We'd rather you come than not come. So if you have a logo deadline the next morning, you have to work on this logo, we give a little leeway to let people sketch that stuff. But we do have themes, like this was from the monster theme. This actually later became my Grendel design for a Beowulf adaptation I did for HarperCollins. So although technically I didn't do it as actual work, it did end up becoming a real job. This guy is just a turtle. I don't know what he's about. But this is some of the drawings I do in that group here. This guy's eyes come out of his nose. The concept of 2.5 baby, so this was my 0.5 baby. Of course, just random characters. This guy on the left ended up looking a little bit like a Star Wars character. So anyway, it's really fun. It's very energetic, and it's as far as a limit of inspiration, it is an inspirational night that can kind of carry you for a few days if you start one. I know New Orleans did start one. I'm not sure if Baton Rouge has one or not, but it's become sort of a national phenomenon. I think there are 35 nationwide drink and draw social clubs. All right, next lesson is don't be a geezer. Everything you love is once a new idea, and an older generation hated it. I guarantee every single thing. So don't be this guy. Don't be the geezer. So sometimes things are going to suck. New things are going to suck, but a lot of times there is some cool stuff. Sometimes some new music is going to be pretty good. There's going to be some new writers out there that you should maybe check out. New films, whatever. Even if it's some totally new area you haven't gone to. If you're a great designer and you've never even considered web design, don't be a geezer. Dabble with it, try it, experiment. You might find that you're very good at it and you might like it. Self-promotion, this is a very big problem I see. People spend endless time promoting that they're great at something, yet we never see it, right? There's people out there that promote every service, every ability, and they never show that ability. We never see them doing work. So I say let your work be your sales pitch. It's by far the most effective. If I'm working on a job and I need a great photographer, the first people in my head that come to mind are the great photos I've seen from those great photographers. The fact that they might post 20 times on Twitter a day has no impact on my decision to hire them. My first thought instantly goes to how good was their photography, right? And I'm sure we all think that way, but when it comes to self-promotion, we tend to think the opposite. So I say let your work be your sales pitch. And here's some fuzzy math for you, but 99% great work, 3% self-promotion equals 110%. All right, networking, the only network technique you ever need. And I discovered this sort of by accident because early on I was more of an introvert when I started doing networking, and I needed to find a way to network even though I was horrible at it. And I kind of stumbled upon this idea, but really just one question has worked wonders for me through the years and created countless jobs and opportunities. I ask people what they do. What do you do for a living? almost everyone you meet has a little bit of narcissism. They love to talk about themselves, and they will. And they'll tell you about what they do, they'll tell you their industry, and after some point they'll stop talking and they'll ask you what you do. And this is why the trick works so well, is because you already know all about them. If they're in the medical industry, and I worked for Blue Cross and Blue Shield a little bit, I can then tell them about my background as an art director on Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And so now I have an entry point into doing business with that person that just talked about themselves for 10 minutes. So they will actually, when you ask someone what they do, they'll actually tell you the right way to enter that conversation and what you need to present to them, if you're interested in that. If you're just making friends, it works as well too, but on the business side, it works wonders. And next, be uncomfortable. And this is tricky for people because we start to build these barriers and these walls where we're afraid to try something we haven't tried before because we might not be good at it, right? And it happens all the time. It happens to me almost every day. And that's one of the reasons why I do stuff like this, or the HOW conference, or I do presentations at various Comic-Cons. It gets me out of my comfort zone. I'm forced to learn something new. I'm forced to meet new people and start to grow as a person and as a creator. And so thank you all for letting me be uncomfortable in front of you. And you can follow me on Twitter, Kody Chamberlain. Thank you. Also, to try to get you all drawing and sketching, I do have pencils right outside the door on your way out. So please grab a pencil, sharpen it, and do some sketching today. Thank you.